So someone posted on here detailing the unusualness of their fiancé, which triggered me to write this post. About my fiancé. I am getting close to the end of my rope. If possible, I'd like any advice at all. This all started happening a few weeks ago. My fiancé seemed radiantly happy, going about making wedding plans, when her mood suddenly took a 180. I was late getting home from work that day, and when I got home, the entire house was dark. It was 7 o'clock on a summer evening, though, so the lack of lights wasn't too disturbing. But I know this girl, and she loves having tons of lights on everywhere. We regularly argue about her leaving the bedside light on when she sleeps. She's scared of the dark, which I find an adorably childish thing about her. Normally she comes running to greet me, with a bundle of endless chatter, asking me how my day was, a pretty bug she'd seen while she was out walking, what sort of things she'd done around the house. But it was completely silent and still when I got in. Thinking she might be upstairs, I went looking for her, only to find it empty. At this point, I was more curious than anything and sent her a text. I heard my text tone for her phone register inside the wall. At first, my mind was a blank, but then it occurred to me she was for some reason in the loft room which butted up against our bedroom. The loft room is in the unrefurbished part of the house, which is a farmhouse of 175 years. The floor is broken in, it's full of shit thrown in from years of remodeling, a kitchen island, a honest-to-goodness icebox, and there's a little set up steps, no more than a glorified ladder, leading to a little loft. The loft is about a 10 by 10 foot space of ancient, warped boards, nails jutting out and sheet insulation. There's a tiny little room that was put up in probably the 1950s that's no more than a closet. It's maybe 5.5 to 6 feet long, only big enough to put in a bed. There's hooks in it to hang clothes, no windows or electricity. My fiancée understandably thinks this room is incredibly creepy. She rarely goes in except to throw in bric-a-brac and store her garden supplies. So I went back through the house to get to the loft, and called up to her. No response, so I went up the rickety little set of stairs and peeked into the loft. There she was, sitting on the floor of the little loft room, knees drawn to her chest, arms raised up to her face, and blood freaking everywhere. Feelings of dread and panic as I rushed over to her. She was sitting in a bed of glass, which was slowly turning from white to red. She had rivers of blood running down her forearms, shins, knees, and face. I managed to extricate her from the pile without doing any more damage to her. The whole time, I kept asking what was wrong and how had this happened, but got absolutely no response. Her eyes were so wide I could practically see the whites around her irises. Her face was deathly pale, but I couldn't tell if it was shock or lack of blood. She was dead cold. Not wanting to tempt fate, I took her to the hospital. Luckily, only a few of the cuts needed stitches, and none on her face, but she ended up swaddled in bandages. While she really didn't need blood, the doctors gave her an IV with fluids, and she eventually came around from her state of deep shock. I stayed with her through the whole thing, knowing she would probably be scared if she was alone. Until that moment, she didn't really seem to register her surroundings. So when she looked at me and reached out to hold my hand, I knew she was somewhat back. I asked her what had happened, and she only shook her head. She's honestly not very good at explaining long and detailed events, but I grilled her. Eventually I managed to extract some details. She had been making dinner when she had heard something upset in the loft room. She went to go investigate and found a stack of boards had fallen almost onto the stairs, and she went to push it back up. Once she was up in the loft, she became curious of the little loft room, which she had never really wanted to investigate, and went in. She had only been in there for a few minutes picking through the stuff in it before something blocked out the light behind her. She couldn't really explain it. She started making excuses, saying she didn't want to talk about it, because she was scared. After nearly 10 minutes of persuading her, she said she thought it was a man, but he had moved into the room so fast. He had a pane of glass that hadn't been used in the restoration, and when she'd stepped back to defend herself and subsequently fallen, he smashed the thing over her. But here's the thing, she said it didn't really hit her. It was like the glass had detonated with the force of a bomb before it had. And the man had darted out of the room and around the corner, where she heard footsteps circling her room rapidly. This went on for some time before she heard me enter the house. Then the footsteps descended the loft room, and the door from the loft room to the outside opened and shut. But she was so scared, it was like she couldn't move. She got my text, and still she couldn't move. Eventually, I got the gist and found her in the loft. She had wanted to scream at me to run, to be careful, that the man was still around, but she couldn't move or speak. I dug her out of the glass, took her out to the car, and she said she couldn't see any evidence of the man at all. I wanted to file a police report, but she was adamantly against it. I eventually let it drop, intending to tell my large and well-armed family about the incident. It didn't occur to her at the time to tell me not to tell anyone else. We went home with the warning of infections and changing bandages and etc. She seemed terrified to fall asleep, and cried intermittently on the way home. When we were pulling into the driveway, she admitted to me she couldn't explain anything about the man. Maybe the pane of glass had fallen on her, and her mind had made up the rest. I agreed it was a possibility, and she actually seemed comforted. She fell asleep on the couch. I sat up for some time, unable to sleep. Her good humor resumed, but slightly cautiously. She went back to wedding planning, and I told my family to be on the lookout for the man. And then nearly a week after the first incident, I came home early for lunch one afternoon. The kitchen was empty, but the doors leading to the loft room were open. I walked over to investigate, and found my fiancé looking into the open door of the loft room with a long, wicked-looking knife in her hand. She's small, but can exhibit extreme fits of strength while in a fit of fear or anger. I've seen her go through a branch on a maple with a machete. So I kept my distance and asked her in a clear and loud voice what was she doing. She nearly jumped out of her skin, reached out, and slammed the door shut. She said she thought she'd heard something in the loft room. I fetched a gun, loaded it with some slugs and ascended the stairs. Empty and still the pile of bloody glass was still there. There was a sharp snap at the bottom of the stairs, and I immediately turned. The screen door to the outside of the house had just clicked shut. The wooden storm door was open, with a great, gaping gash in it. I went back down the stairs to find my fiancée, only to see her outside, by the tall grass in the yard that separated us from the hayfield next to our house. She had her knife raised, and, as I watched, leapt into the grass. I felt like I couldn't move fast enough. I was about to hit the door when my fiancé's tiny little voice chirped up behind me.
"Did you find anything?"
Sad, bedraggled, and bandaged, she stood there anxiously clasping her hands together. I told her I didn't. I was not going to go outside. I was going to keep my shotgun handy, and if I got any visitors that night, I was going to shoot them. As it was, I did get a number of strange phone calls that night. I was called into work, only to find that the person who had supposedly called me confused. They hadn't called, and nothing was wrong. I had brought my fiancée along with me. She was eager to not be alone in the house. The second we pulled into the driveway of the house, I got another phone call, the same person calling me for the same reason, and flipping out to the point where he was screaming. But there was no background noise in my line of work. It's messy, it's dirty, and it's always loud. This guy sounded like he was standing in a quiet room. I just hung up the phone and told my fiancé it was nothing. I turned off my phone and we went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to my fiancé shifting. I thought she was getting out of bed, but when I sat up, I saw her standing at the far window, just staring. Kind of shifting back and forth from foot to foot. I went over to her and asked her what was wrong. She said she was watching the man in the lawn. If she took her eyes off of him, he would move, and come into the house. She was protecting me. I looked out, and could see nothing. The halogen light installed when I first moved in cast light all the way to the road. All I could see were shadows. I realized she was probably sleepwalking, and she wouldn't notice the difference of being in front of the window or being in bed, so I lead her back, lay her down and plastered myself to her. She fell immediately to sleep and didn't move again the whole night. It was a little disturbing, and when I woke up, I felt a blind little moment of panic. I shook her, and when she didn't respond, called her name and shook her harder. Eventually she stirred, making upset little chirping noises, so I let her fall back asleep with a kiss. Then I noticed the scratches on her back. They weren't nearly as bad as the cuts she'd sustained before, but I could see where a couple of them had reopened. Little trickles of blood were running onto the bed, in fact, so I woke her up anyway. She would freak out if she woke up in a pool of her own blood. I persuaded her to come downstairs, informing her she'd scratched her back, and she matter-of-factly told me it hadn't been her, it had been the man with the crazy eyes. What the hell? She'd mumbled this, and she sounded half asleep, so I put this aside and lead her downstairs. Now the stairs, for whatever reason, have another normal bedroom door attached to them at the bottom, so you have to open it before you get all the way down. Occasionally, it will be left open, or even partially open, by fiancé or I. This morning, it was open a crack. And I could see someone in the crack looking up at us as we descended. I let go of my fiancé and ran down the rest of the stairs, intending to hit the door and smash the face of the person. They wouldn't have been able to get away in time. Indeed, I felt a satisfactory thump as the door hit something solid, and then it just kind of melted. Like the resistance was bleeding out of it. The face that was turned up, watching us, turned into a figure darting past the door. An instant later, I heard a clatter in the loft room, and the screen door slamming. Fiancé suddenly tears past me and out the front screen door. I had not at all been prepared for this and missed my opportunity to grab her as she passed. By the time I hit the front door, she's racing at a clump of weeds and long grass rustling, but she's only halfway across the lawn. I shout at her, and she stops dead. I put on a burst of speed and catch up to her. Fight ensues, we go back inside. I'm furious she ran after the thing. She had been furious, and was contrite. She really didn't know what had come over to her. At this point, I'm starting to get wary of leaving her alone in the house and take her to work with me. We don't talk about what we saw or what happened. This turns out to be a good thing. We get back at a reasonable time and have dinner. The only downfall is the overwhelming scent of gas. At first, I was afraid the stove had been left on, or there was a gas leak. Nothing of the sort. We eventually figured it to be the smell of methane, and something had probably died somewhere. We spent the rest of the daylight hours trying to figure out where it was, because the smell seemed to travel. We eventually pinned it to the outside corner of the kitchen, and we both went outside to investigate. We didn't find any dead animals. We did find 2 clear footprints of a person in bare feet. standing in the soft soil of the garden, right in front of the window. We went back inside. Without really discussing it, we made sure everything was locked and secure. I latched the door to the loft room for the first time. It's an I-latch, so there's no way to open it from the loft room. We went to bed shortly thereafter. Fiancé closed the door and surreptitiously moved the trash in front of it. That night, my fiancé woke up talking in her sleep no less than 5 times. As you can imagine, neither of us slept great. I went into work feeling like shit, alone this time because fiancé insisted on staying at home. There was quite a stir at work when I got there. Apparently, my uncle had shot a very strange animal. While we aren't really deck crazy, apparently they thought bringing this mystery animal to them was probably for the best. It was in the back of his truck, and, curious, I went over to see. It looked like some sort of badly constructed dog. Its forelegs and chest were remarkably bigger than its hindquarters. Its feet were canid, but hairless, and the toes had a prehensile look to them. Its face was the worst though. Hey guys, sorry for the excessively long wait. This weekend has been fucking crazy, which I will explain hopefully shortly. Basically, it has ended up with my wife in the emergency room again. I am beginning to get sick of this motherfucker. But first, let me finish what happened 2 weeks ago. I was talking about this dog. It was ugly as fucking sin. Its face was nearly simian. It was nearly flat with dog-like lips and a dog-like forehead. But its nostrils were huge and curled. It had died eating something. There were scraps of what looked to be fur in its mouth, and blood in its teeth. My uncle said he had shot it while it had been trying to climb a tree near their camp. And no, I didn't take a picture of the thing, thank fuck. Besides, I was busy, and I really only stopped to glance at it before moving on to do my work. I go through my morning work like normal, which is refreshing. I don't feel worried, and my fiancé hasn't called me about anything. I feel like I'm ahead of the game when I spot someone crouching beside one of the buildings. Even from where I am, I can see his huge fucking eyes just staring at me, his mouth in a huge O. When I catch sight of him, he ducks behind the building he's beside, and I can see him running, hunched over through the mesh that makes up the walls of the building. He's very fast, almost like an animal. I keep my cool. I spread the word to the rest of the workers, and they vow to keep an eye out for him. By this time, it's time for lunch, and I'm relieved. My brain has already been fucked with enough for one day, and I head to my truck. Once I get there, I'm about to climb into my truck when I open the door and the stench of rotting flesh and wet fur rolls out. And there's nothing in my truck. It smells bad enough to be the ape dog my uncle shot, but it's just the smell. I figure it may just be the place I parked my truck, so I get it and drive off. The smell eventually dissipates, but still lingers when I slow down or stop the truck. When I pull into the driveway is when I realized what was wrong. From where I'm sitting, and due to the attachment on my truck, I can't see into the bed of the truck. I hadn't bothered looking into the box when I got in. So casually, as to not tip off to my fiancé inside that something was wrong, I climb out of my pickup and check into the back. Indeed, the disgusting motherfucker had been jammed into my bed, curled up and twisted around to fit. Before my fiancé could come out to greet me, I got back into my truck and drove back to work, opened the tailgate of my truck when I got there and just let the thing fall onto the lawn. I was feeling exceptionally pissed at whoever had done this, and hadn't wanted to discuss it with anyone. When I actually walked into my house, I could smell lunch cooking, but I also could tell something was wrong. My fiance's face was blotchy and a little wet, which meant she had been crying. She admitted that lately she had been harboring a little cat outside, and had been feeding it scraps and leftover cat food the people who had lived in our house last had left. She said last night, she had heard a cat, presumably her friend, screaming last night as if it were in a fight. And he hadn't come around like he usually did in the morning. It made me think of the ape dog thing, and what I'd seen in its teeth. It had definitely been white and black fur, and I couldn't think of anything in the wild with that combination. I didn't tell her. I sympathized with her, assuring her that cats just make rounds, and he would probably be back soon. I don't feel bad for lying. The truth wouldn't have helped in the slightest. So, after the dog thing, life goes almost back to normal. Until this past weekend. This Friday we were finishing up a big project at work when I get a message from an unknown number. It's a picture, and it's blurry as fuck. I delete the thing and block the number. The message comes in about 6 more times, each with a slightly different picture. I recognize it eventually as my backyard, as seen from a high vantage point. Obviously, this is highly unsettling, and so I call my fiancé and ask her what she's up to. She says she's up a ladder, painting the back porch stoop, terrified as fuck, because she hates heights. I ask her if she's been sending me any pictures. No, she says, it's all she can do to not fall off the ladder. If I want a picture of her work, she'd be happy to send one, however. I give her the go-ahead, and she sends me a picture while we're talking. Her work is good, but what I also see in the picture makes my blood curdle. I immediately catch sight of a face in the window above the stoop, clear as day, with the same huge, unnerving eyes as the man I'd seen a week before. I'm about to tell my fiancé to get down from the ladder and get away from the house when I hear her shriek. I hear the phone hit something and then hit the ground. Something much heavier than the phone immediately follows, and the sound of the ladder upsetting. And then nothing but silence and muffled birdsong. I call out to my fiancé multiple times and get nothing but silence. She's fallen and she's broken her neck is my only thought as I abandon the project, get into my truck and do 80 as I drive back to the house. From on top of the hill, I can see the crumpled mess of my fiancé and the ladder on the ground. I don't even bother using the driveway. I drive across the lawn to get directly to her. My dread is lessened somewhat when I see her moving beneath the ladder. She reaches up and pushes the thing off of her and sits up clutching her head. Blood is everywhere. I get out and assess the wound. She has a deep as fuck gash in her scalp. Even as she looks up at me and asks where the fucking asshole man went, she passes out. I run into the house and grab towels and press one to her head and call an ambulance. We get to the hospital where she requires yet more stitches. She's unconscious for nearly 13 hours. When she did wake up, I had already gone home to get cleaned up and a change of clothes. When I walked in, I was delighted to see she was awake. She was crying a little, but mostly because she was really happy to see me. She had woken up in the room alone. This time, she very freely told me what she had seen and what had happened. She said there had been a man crouching kind of like a lizard on the top of the stoop. She had said for the longest time, she had heard this nauseating crunching sound, like something chewing, coming from above her. When she had finally looked up after she had taken her picture, she had seen the man. She had jolted, startled, and let out an involuntary shriek, lost her balance and fell. When she woke up, the man was gone, I was there, and then she'd passed out again.